Hi everyone, it's Carisha here now, and I am going to be tackling the second big topic of this week, which is PISA. So I'm going to begin with what PISA is not. It is not a leaning tower in Italy. We are curious to know if you have heard what it is before this course, and we've suggested that as one of the discussion questions for this week because we wish we could do a quick poll and find out who has heard of PISA before. And before we dive into looking at the paper, I wanted to give you some brief background about who runs it, what exactly it is, when, where, and how it's administered, how it's presented, how the results are used, and then get into the criticisms presented by Schoberg and Jenkins once we know what PISA actually is, so that then we can critique it. This week is heavy on the acronyms, so starting with a few of the key terms. PISA stands for the Program for International Student Assessment, and is run by the OECD, which stands for the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Now, I have their mission statement according to the OECD website here, but I want to give you a quick bit of background on them. The OECD are an intergovernmental economic organization that was actually originally founded in Europe in 1948 to administer American and Canadian aid as part of the Marshall Plan for the reconstruction of Europe post-World War II. So those beginnings turned into 1961 with membership being opened up to non-European countries, and their stated goals became stimulating economic progress and world trade. So the member countries are committed to democracy and a market economy and are mostly developed countries with high income economies and a high human development index. Countries have a higher human development index when the lifespan is higher, the education level is higher, and the gross national income per capita is higher. So that gives you an idea of the type of countries involved in the OECD and running the show here behind PISA. If you want a little bit more information, I've given you the link there and you can check it out. So PISA is designed to measure 15-year-olds' ability to use their reading, math, and science knowledge and skills to meet real-life challenges, according to the OECD. They've got a little video on their YouTube website, and I've shared the link here. And the video actually focuses more on what the test is rather than how it's done, so I'm going to share a few of those how details with you. After every sitting, the OECD publishes a brochure that outlines all of their insight and perspectives from that most recent writing of PISA. And this is an excerpt from the 2019 publication focusing on the 2018 writing. The key part I want to highlight here is the phrase, PISA is not only the world's most comprehensive and reliable indicator of students' capabilities, it is also a powerful tool that countries and economies can use to fine-tune their education policies. That's a very interesting statement because right off the bat, as the opening abstract to the report, they are equating country and economy as being the same thing and linking those to educational policies, which is going to be a theme that we see come up later on in part of the criticisms in the paper. Now, at any point, if you'd like to pause any of these slides and look at them and read and digest, please feel free to do so. To save you from having to potentially dig into a 64-page document, I've pulled just a few highlights from their 2018 review. And I want to point out a few key phrases that the OECD claims that typical measures of schooling are not reliable indicators of what people actually know and can do. They point out that the idea behind PISA in testing the knowledge and skills of students directly through a metric that was internationally agreed upon, and then linking that with data from students, teachers, schools, and systems to understand performance differences. And they go on to say that they're going to be able to act on the data by leveraging peer pressure. That kind of raises some red flags as soon as you're using peer pressure to do something. They also state that the aim with PISA is to shift from looking upward within the education system towards looking outward and comparing to the next teacher, the next school, the next country. Additionally, they claim that the PISA goes beyond assessing whether students can reproduce what they have learned in school and instead being able to extrapolate from what they know And they know that people are being critical of the PISA assessment. So OECD comes right out and meets those criticisms head on, saying some people argue that the PISA tests are unfair because they may confront students with problems they've not encountered in school. But then life is unfair because the real test in life is not whether we can remember what we learned at school, but whether we'll be able to solve problems that we can't possibly anticipate today. That's pretty bluntly facing the criticisms that are put towards them. So they know that they're taking the heat sometimes. So the PISA assessment is a triennial assessment which first started in the year 2000. And every 3 years, it looks at students' knowledge and skills in the three subjects of reading, math, and science, with each assessment focusing on one of the major subjects and the other two just being a summary assessment. The key points I want to draw your attention to are that science was the focus in 2006, 2015, and will be coming up again in what would have been 2024 but has been bumped to 2025 due to the pandemic. Of interest too was in 2012 when mathematics was the key focus. Financial literacy was a secondary focus, and I'm going to mention that later on. Students did so poorly that they included financial literacy again 3 years later. So in 2015, when science was the main focus and collaborative problem solving was the secondary focus, financial literacy was given as an optional add-on that countries could do a second little piece of the exam to go along with it and have another data point on how students were doing in that area. The next cycle up should be in 2021 with math as the main focus, but that's been bumped to 2022 with both the current and subsequent cycle being deliberately delayed due to the pandemic-related challenges of trying to administer a test in a country where in-person schooling is not taking place and it's not a mandatory test that's part of the curriculum. So they've just decided to put each of the next two off for 1 year apiece. International participation in PISA has grown steadily since year 2000, when there was originally 32 countries/economies, that's how OECD counts them, that participated. And in the most recent sitting in 2018, there were 79. So it's more than doubled over the last 2 decades. For 2021, there was over 86 countries/economies that were expected to participate. But with the exam being bumped back to 2022 and the delays due to the pandemic, it remains to be seen how many of those countries will continue to choose to participate in the next writing cycle. So Canada has participated in PISA since the beginning in year 2000 through a partnership with CMEC, Employment and Social Development Canada, and Statistics Canada. So I had to go look up what CMEC stands for, and acronym bingo, that is the Council of Ministers of Education Canada. And when I dug around to find out what that is, it is an intergovernmental body founded in 1967 by ministers of education with a goal of discussing policy issues, consulting with national education organizations and the federal government, and representing the educational interests of province and territories internationally. All 13 provinces and territories are members, and their goal is to provide leadership in education at the pan-Canadian and international levels while supporting the exclusive jurisdiction of provinces and territories over education. So 16 years into my teaching career, I had never heard of this group, and I was very surprised to hear that we actually have at the national level a group trying to bring a cohesive picture to the varied educational curricula and goals across Canada. A couple of concrete examples of what they do. They sponsor research in education-related statistics. They help administer Canada's national official languages programs. They consult and act on issues in early childhood learning, elementary secondary education, post-secondary education, and adult learning and skills development. They have current priorities with Indigenous education, global competencies, and if you would like to learn more about them, www.cmec.ca and have a look. The key point that I want to bring it back to PISA is that all 10 provinces have participated in each assessment, which represents about 20,000 Canadian students from about 1,000 schools that have taken part in each PISA assessment in either English or French. And the schools and students within the schools are selected randomly for participation, which we'll talk about next. The fact that Canada has such a large sample size actually allows results to be reported for each individual province, as well as broken down by the French and English language school systems. Of important note is that currently the 3 territories do not participate in PISA, nor do Indigenous students from band-operated schools. So that was a surprise to me. The results are valid at the provincial level as well as at the pan-Canadian level, but no PISA results come back for individual schools or individual students. So this is not an assessment of individual student achievement. We're only looking at the aggregate data. So the first of 3 parts of how is PISA administered, I'm going to look at the students, the tests, and the questionnaires that go out to multiple groups of people. With the students, the goal of PISA is to target students between the ages of 15 years 3 months and 16 years 2 months that are enrolled in grade 7 or higher. And this age was chosen because by 15, young people in most OECD countries are actually close to the end of their compulsory education. The selection of schools and students is as inclusive as possible to make sure students come from a broad range of backgrounds and abilities. And schools include all types of educational institution, including public and private. Students could be enrolled full-time or part-time. And there's a 2-stage sampling procedure where first they select a representative sample of at least 150 schools, taking into account factors like location, whether the school's rural, town, urban, level of education at that school. And then the second stage is that roughly 42 15-year-olds are randomly selected from each school to sit the assessment. Most countries end up with between 4,000 and 8,000 students sitting, so Canada is actually on the higher end of that. Students can be excluded for various reasons, including remote school, inaccessibility of their school, intellectual or physical disability, a lack of proficiency in the test language. So for example, if the students received instruction in the test language for less than 1 year, which might be some of our ELL learners, or a lack of test material in the language of instruction. But anywhere for countries where the overall level of exclusions actually exceeds the limit significantly, they have to provide further information to support the case that there will be no bias in comparisons over time with other countries that might result from such heavy exclusions. Because of those exclusions, the demographic composition of PISA samples does change over time, reflecting changes in enrollment rates or migrations, and that also is going to be reflected in the interpretation of the trends. So to support that interpretation, that's why PISA discusses the major contextual changes, and it presents the adjusted trends accounting for changes in student population, as well as making available the basic non-adjusted performance trends. Originally, PISA was done on paper, but computer-based tests have been used in most countries, starting in Canada since 2015. And there's actually more than 15 hours of test items that are created as a main bank for reading, math, and science and global competence questions. But different students take different combinations of the test items, so an individual student writes an assessment that just lasts a total of 2 hours. And 2 students writing right next to each other may not have the same exam questions. The test items are a mixture of multiple choice questions. Some questions require students to construct their own responses and type them out. The items are organized into groups based on a passage of text and then some real life situation that goes with it and the interpretation of those questions. When they're done the 2-hour exam, students also answer a background questionnaire, which takes about half an hour to complete. And I've actually had students in my class involved in this twice. So when the students are involved, they are given a permission form for the parents. When the parents say yes, admin sends around a list of the excused students, and you're told you have to release those students to go to write the exam, and it takes them half the day. So for us, it was that they never came to class in the morning, and they were done at lunchtime. And they write in a secure supervised location, which for us was the Library Learning Commons, where all of the computer banks were. When the students are done their 2-hour knowledge exam, that's when the survey pops up on their computer and they complete a background questionnaire that gathers demographic information about their home, their school, their learning experiences, their parental involvement, which is very interesting, and their future goals. School principals also complete a questionnaire that covers the school system and the learning environment, and that also takes about a half an hour. And some of the questions are from the same question, but from a different perspective as the students had. In some countries, there's also optional questionnaires that can be distributed to parents who are asked to provide information about their involvement in their child's school, support for learning at home, and their perception of their child's career expectations. Countries can also choose other optional questionnaires for students. One recently was about their use of information and communication technology. Another was an extended survey asking students about their education to date, including interruptions with schooling and how they might prepare for a future career. If you're curious to see actual examples of test questions, they are available on the OECD website. I've shared a link here, and I'm going to look at a few of those questionnaire questions from the survey and a few of the actual exemplars from one of the science exams later on here. If you are interested in the framework, which is published in advance of any writing, so for the 2021 session coming up, the context and exemplars are all available on the website link that I provided. And after each writing, all of the results, graphics, charts, raw data are made publicly available on the OECD website, and I've shared that link as well. So anybody has access to those to be able to reanalyze that data in any way they see fit. The data often appears in the news media as tables of rankings, bar graphs of how Canada compares to other countries. And here we've got the Council of Ministers of Education having taken some of that data and put it together as infographics, Canada compared to the OECD for reading. And this was off of the 2018 one, so focused primarily on reading. It broke it down by high performers, low performers, and gender differences based on student self-identification on the student questionnaire. So you can actually use this data in a lot of different ways and get some interesting qualitative subsets of data out of it as well. Of course, the OECD also uses the data to make some self-promotion videos and infographics that they circulate to the media as well. These couple of videos are interesting. The first video follows up on how two countries actually based educational reforms off of the PISA results. The second video examines some trends in gender gaps seen over multiple assessments where female students were consistently behind in several areas. And I did mention earlier the 2012 assessment that focused on math with that secondary topic of financial literacy. The last video actually presents the worrisomely low financial literacy skills seen across all countries. And because they were so low, that's why financial literacy was considered an optional topic and offered again on the subsequent writing. So one way that Canada and some other countries are using the PISA results is to track some longitudinal studies and gather data there. They are following the cohort of students that sat the very first PISA assessments in the early 2000s and tracking them all the way through into adulthood. One of the interesting trends that they've noted is that even after accounting for socioeconomic status, and that includes parental educational levels, they found that students who performed better in PISA at age 15 have stronger education and employment outcomes at age 25. Another interesting trend was that what the students said about themselves in the PISA questionnaires was also strongly correlated to their future life prospects. It is interesting then that Canada is seeing a correlation, not a causation, but a correlation between performance on PISA at age 15 and future educational and economic outcomes for students. Because if we go back to that earlier description of PISA, where they stated PISA is not only the world's most comprehensive and reliable indicator of students' capabilities, it is also a powerful tool that countries and economies can use to fine-tune their education policies. There may be something in that that's good data, that's positive, that we can take something away from. But at the same time, a major criticism is that the OECD is using the assessment data to rank countries against each other. So part of one of the major concerns about PISA is how that data is used. And that's similar to here in BC, where the Fraser Institute uses the FSA, Foundation Skills Assessment data, to rank schools against each other as well. That it may not necessarily be what we should be taking away from that data as a take-home message. So the last time science was the major focus on a PISA exam was 2015. And as I mentioned, I actually had 3 students pulled out of my class to go and write that. So I had looked it up a little bit at the time, but I actually looked it up in much more detail now. They still have all of the framework available. And it was interesting to note how explicit they were in what they were assessing. They were specifically looking for 3 science competencies: to explain phenomena scientifically, to evaluate and design scientific inquiries, and to interpret data and evidence scientifically. They were explicit that they were examining 2 knowledge types, both content knowledge and procedural or epistemic knowledge. And they were doing that across 3 content areas of physical systems, living systems, and earth and space systems, over 3 contexts of personal, local, and global situations. The follow-up survey, the student questionnaire that went with it, also measured students interested in awareness of science and their perceived value of scientific approaches. So taking those things together was very interesting, and I've actually pulled a few specific examples, which you can skip past if you like, or you could actually have a look at them. So I've also included these in the PDF that we made, and they are interesting questions that might make great mini activities or discussion starters in science class or in math class, because as you're about to see, many of these types of problems seem strikingly similar to some of the questions students are tasked with on the BC numeracy exams. So from the OECD website, in 2015, they released exemplars of the various questions after the fact. And here's a short list. The first few, bee colony, fossil fuels, volcanic eruptions, groundwater, and power plant, were all 4 or 5 questions linked together by the common theme, with students doing some reading and interpretation. Remember that there is a bank of 15 hours worth of questions. So students wouldn't have all of these. Students would just have some of these questions. And the last 3 here were simulations. So adjustable glasses, running in hot weather, and an energy efficient house, where the students actually had to slide some sliders, click some buttons, gather some data, pop it in a table, and then analyze it in a program with an app that they've never done before. So something that comes up later on in Schoberg and Jenkins' paper is students' motivation to actually follow all the way through with these types of questions. So you can hit pause on any of these slides and look at them for a longer time and digest them. But I just wanted to show you this one, number 1 of a sequence of 5. It's very heavy on the reading before a student can even get to the science knowledge to start making connections between ecosystems and how the species are linked. Skipping question number 2 about the bee colony, I've jumped to question number 3, where again, we've got different information to read through, some multiple choice questions to look at, based on a graph to interpret, and the numeracy skills that they're expecting are interesting because as far as my knowledge of the grades 7, 8, 9, 10 curriculum goes, students aren't working with something like micrograms per kilogram until grade 11 in the BC curriculum, and they may not have done unit changes because that was removed from a lot of the math curriculum. So there's some heavy duty math and numeracy skills tied into supporting the science that's in this question and the interpretation that needs to come of it. So this slide with fossil fuels, skipping to another example, is number 2 of a sequence of 4 questions, requires the students to read, follow the flow chart, interpret a table, and then write out some type of coherent answer. It's talking about CO2 cycling in the atmosphere and trapping it, and that might be something that students have seen as part of Science 9 with the carbon cycle. But just a reminder that PISA is not intended to be directly linked to any part of the curriculum in any particular area. So question 3 of 4 in the sequence, right after that previous one, again about fossil fuels, requiring some new information to read, interpreting numerical data, and then working with graphical data to turn that into some type of coherently communicated answer. Finally, this is an example of what a student might see on their screen if they were looking at one of these simulations, where they have to move a slider, run a simulation, choose some different parameters, think about a chart and a table of data, and then select some conclusions from a drop-down menu. Now, for the student questionnaire, these were the instructions that they were given, and they're asked to answer some demographic information as well as information about their science learning. So feel free to pause and look at any of these slides for a longer amount of time and read the information. Where it does have the funny little brackets that says school science, because this is computer generated, that's an autofill field that's going to fill with the appropriate topic that was in the 2-hour exam that the student just wrote, because this pops up at the end of the exam. The students are asked to gauge the response on a 4-point Likert scale, where they are not allowed to be neutral, so they have to land on the agree or disagree side. And all of the focus here is about their future-oriented motivations towards science, which I pulled because it ties into our recent discussions about students and whether they see themselves continuing with careers in science. So once this is cross-referenced with the demographic data that students have provided, it starts to give us some insight about trends with females and male students and things like that. This one's interesting because the topics here, I'm going to come back specifically to a few of these questions later on when speaking about the paper. These are all mostly focused around inquiry-based learning. And students can rank it from happening all the time to happening hardly ever. And this is one of the points that is critiqued in the Schoberg and Jenkins paper. Finally, I couldn't resist highlighting this question from the questionnaire because if you read through what the student is being asked to rank, and again, no neutral allowed, they have to side with agree or disagree, they're all questions about the nature of science and the student's experience with that type of learning. So I thought that you might find that interesting. So this came based on the 2015 results and in response to the type of survey questionnaire questions that you just saw. Data was compiled, countries were ranked, results were disseminated, and this was one of many infographics that were produced. But again, I chose to highlight this one because it presents an interesting perspective, tying back to the first part of this week's discussion on STEM. So having seen some example of gender-based data, infographic data, the actual questions, the survey questionnaires that go out, and combined with all of the actual administrivia of the PISA exam, I think we know enough about PISA to dive into the paper and get critical and start thinking critically about the PISA assessment. So walking us through that in their paper are Sven Schoberg, who is a professor of science education at the University of Oslo in Norway, and Edgar Jenkins, who is a professor of science education at the University of Leeds in the UK. So what objections or criticisms did they actually have about PISA? You might have a few red flags already. I alluded to a few of the major criticisms as we were coming through various sections of the PISA exam. And Schoberg and Jenkins had many in their paper that they considered. So right out of the gate, they compared PISA to TIMSS, which is another standardized assessment. So just when you thought we were done with acronym bingo, TIMSS is the Trends in International Mathematics and Science Study. There's many similarities between PISA and TIMSS. It's listed in the appendix to the paper, but I've summarized the key differences here in the table. And a couple of the key differences that I wanted to highlight is that PISA is done by the OECD with a view towards improving economies, but TIMSS is driven by researchers. PISA says it addresses real-life challenges, where TIMSS is specifically related to school curricula. PISA just pulls a few students, age 15 to 16, across individual classes, but TIMSS actually looks at an entire grade 4 class and its teacher, or an entire grade 8 class and its teacher. So it gathers a different set of statistical data. The PISA is done every 3 years with 3 subjects, but only 1 subject is the main focus each year. So it's going to be quite some time before that subject comes back around to being the main focus again. TIMSS is done every 4 years on just the 2 subjects of math and science, and equal testing time is given on each subject. So TIMSS comes up quite often as a counter to PISA when critical analysis is being done. To start, Schoberg and Jenkin make the fair point that statistics can be easily manipulated to impact any kind of national rankings. Some specific examples that they point to are that in Vietnam, grade 9 is at the end of the formal schooling for most students, meaning 44% of students actually no longer attend school by age 15. So the authors question whether a high ranking for Vietnam should be construed as a successful school system, given that almost half the students have already left it. The authors also expressed concern regarding a similar issue with China, who initially only included results from Shanghai, which is both a province and a city. And in that area, the hukou system still determines school registration. So from what I could find in references cited by the authors, this is a hereditary system where education is a social service only provided to households registered in that province. So if you moved from outside the province, you're considered a migrant. And even if your children are born in the new province, they are still tied to their hereditary household province of origin. So families might be able to send their children to a vocational elementary or middle school, not an academic one. But in many cases, children actually have to return to their home province for high school, which would drastically change the composition of 15-year-olds in Shanghai, since up to 40% of the population are considered migrants that moved from a rural area to the urban center. So this would be like saying your parents moved to Vancouver from Saskatchewan, and if you want to attend grade 10 or up, you can't do it in Vancouver. You have to go back to Saskatchewan, and if you want to go to post-secondary, you could only do so by writing an entrance exam from a high school in Saskatchewan. So Schoberg and Jenkins point out that that actually creates a bit of an inconsistency in the data because, again, a large number of the 15-year-olds might be missing. They also point out that in more recent data where more Chinese provinces than just Shanghai were included, if those were combined with the Shanghai data, and Shanghai had ranked fairly high, as a true national score, it actually brings China's ranking down to be similar to the UK, Slovenia, or Australia. So based on what they choose to include or exclude, countries can work around the statistics and try to improve or alter their ranking and scores. Now, I do want to take a moment to point out that Canada is not perfect either. While we do include both private and public schools, we do not include the 3 territories, and we do not include Indigenous students from band-operated schools. So the big take-home point that the authors are concerned with right out of the gate is the exclusion rate. And the proportion of the eligible students that are excluded varies considerably from country to country and year to year. So they make the argument that that has a big impact on the statistics if you're only going to look at 15-year-old students. The second main point that the authors make is how PISA scales the data to rank countries. And they reference Danish statistician Sven Kreiner, who published several articles where he reanalyzed the publicly available PISA data and obtained very different rankings for countries. So after going through numerous peer-reviewed publications, the critiques finally influenced PISA to actually change their scaling model for 2015, but that resulted in rankings of several countries changing drastically. And Schoberg and Jenkins highlighted that that's a difficulty with statistics when they're being combined in a different way and the country is ranked differently, especially if they've already reformed educational policies to try to improve their ranking, and then the specifics of how the ranking is calculated are changed. Previously, I shared a PISA infographic highlighting that in some countries, there's still gender inequities between parental perceptions of appropriate careers for boys versus girls. And the survey questionnaires also highlight gender inequities that exist in female students' own perceptions of their potential career pathways. So Schoberg and Jenkins actually had some criticisms of the PISA assessment itself with respect to those gender differences in performance. They actually specifically mention Finnish girls as outperforming male students in all 3 subjects, math, science, and reading. That result runs counter to a lot of other national examinations, including TIMSS, which we just saw, where boys usually outperform girls in the math and science. So the authors went and looked at another international assessment, PIRLS, the Progress in International Reading Literacy Study. And that assessment across the board shows that in reading skills, girls outperform boys in every country. So normally we have TIMS, where the boys beat the girls in math and science, and PIRLS, where the girls beat the boys in reading. The authors argue then that the observed trend reversal on the PISA exam with girls outperforming boys is actually due to the heavy demands on reading. Now, that makes me wonder what the authors would have to say about our curriculum here in BC, because that same literacy connection can be seen in our numeracy exams, where there's a heavy emphasis on reading, as well as a heavy emphasis on reading and communication in the BC curricular competencies. So it does highlight interesting gender differences, but there could be other factors at play, and that's the point that the authors are trying to make. So coming from that gender disparity with potentially different strengths in different areas, that brings me to the next topic, which is interest and attitudes towards science. And that's another qualitative piece that's collected off of the student questionnaire. And I shared some clips of those questionnaires where the goal is examining students' attitudes towards science in conjunction with their demographic data. Now, it's interesting that at this point in Schoberg and Jenkins' article, we actually encounter Roger Bybee again. And the authors cite the article by Bybee and McRae, which is a very interesting article, and it's a totally different take on PISA. It has a lot of positive things to say. So where we are looking at Schoberg and Jenkins having quite a critical review, if you wanted to see a different perspective, Bybee and McRae, the 2011 paper, would give you a different perspective on things that they see as useful in the PISA assessment. But in the article here that is cited by Schoberg and Jenkins, Bybee and McRae point out that the 2006 science results for PISA indicated a tendency for students in low-performing countries to show relatively high levels of interest in science, and students in high-achieving countries showing relatively low levels of interest in science, which was surprising, not what one would necessarily expect. Bybee and McRae also pointed out that attitudes towards science play an essential role in students' scientific literacy. Attitudes represent a complex system of cognitions, feelings, and inclinations towards action, and ultimately influence students' continuing interest in and dispositions for positive and constructive responses towards science. Now, the OECD framework also defines science literacy as willingness to engage in science-related issues with the ideas of science as a reflective citizen. Now, Schoberg and Jenkins' main criticism here is they point out that the PISA test does not actually score science literacy. The measure of science literacy is taken from the qualitative, subjective student questionnaire, and they caution that although the PISA definition of science literacy includes interest in science, that's difficult to measure. And given that it doesn't correlate positively with scores on the knowledge portion of the main PISA test, that's also problematic. So that negative correlation is observed when viewed at an aggregate country level, which Schoberg and Jenkins state is a clear pointer to the need for caution in countries that score highly in PISA science tests as role models for reform elsewhere. So as countries are looking to the PISA test to actually change their goals, are they changing for the better? The next logical step from that science literacy piece is inquiry-based learning. So in their paper, another acronym, IBSE, Schoberg and Jenkins refer to inquiry-based science education. And it's something we've talked about previously, so I don't think we need any more background there. But in that questionnaire that I showed you from PISA 2015, there were a total of 9 statements that were related to inquiry-based learning in the student questionnaire. And on my earlier slides, some of those questions included students spend time in the laboratory doing practical experiments, and they had to rank it on a scale of never to always. Students are required to argue about science questions. Students are asked to draw conclusions from experiments they've conducted. Students are allowed to design their own experiments. and students are asked to do an investigation to test ideas. Schoberg and Jenkins are concerned because in countries that score highly on the PISA exam, students report very little use of inquiry-based teaching, leading to the conclusion that, quote, in no education system do students who reported that they were frequently exposed to inquiry-based instruction score higher in science. And that's from the OECD from 2016. So following up with this continuation after the 2006 exam into the 2015 situation where 9 years later we looked at science again, I remember that that was all over the news. So inquiry-based learning was resulting in low scores on the PISA exam. The OECD also explicitly stated that the PISA results indicate activities related to experiments and laboratory work show the strongest negative relationship with science performance. That was stated by the OECD after the 2015 science exam, as cited in Schoberg and Jenkins. I'm going to leave you to potentially unpack that in the discussion. Schoberg and Jenkins are leaving us with this caveat that this is two of the trends that were noted. They're correlational, not causational, but it bears examining because it was also found that inquiry-based teaching is positively correlated with students holding stronger epistemic beliefs and being more likely to expect to work in a science-related occupation when they are 30. Same exam, 2015 science, PISA. So on the one hand, we have high PISA scores, low amounts of inquiry-based teaching, the OECD saying that the PISA results indicate experiments and labs don't correlate to strong science performance, and yet those students that reported high amounts of inquiry-based teaching were the ones most likely to end up in a science-related occupation when they're 30. Overall, that leads Schoberg and Jenkins to give us a huge caveat that this demonstrates a problematic conflict between the recommendations of scientists and educators versus the PISA results and is definitely needing further investigation. Now, this is a fairly short and sweet topic. ICT, Information and Communication Technology, was addressed in the student questionnaire with 2 questions with respect to internet use at school and student use of educational software. And the PISA results indicated a negative relationship between use of information and communication technology and a PISA score. So a special OECD report was commenting on the use of computers in education and stated, resources invested in ICT for education are not linked to improved student achievement in reading, math, or science. In the paper, Schoberg then point out several countries where a high PISA score was correlated with a low amount of ICT usage, and that higher ICT usage didn't necessarily result in better achievement scores on the PISA. Now, many countries are actually still moving towards greater use of information communication technology in schools. And with what happened this last spring during the pandemic, when some schools moved to remote learning for a portion or all of their schooling, it's definitely a place where Schoberg and Jenkins are suggesting that we need further research. And in light of the year we've just had, some of that research may already be ongoing and developing. The authors make another very valid point that we're already familiar with, which is that language and clarity can have a significant impact on understanding of a problem. They give an example of some science terms that don't translate directly between multiple languages. And in the translation, some of those translations could give a hint about the correct answer. In other situations, the translation could present a barrier if it leads to text becoming longer or more cumbersome to read, which then comes back to that literacy issue. Are we judging the literacy or are we judging the scientific knowledge? With respect to motivation, Schoberg and Jenkins also have some critiques to make. And I did show a clip of one of the PISA questions that involved students having to move sliders, fill in a table, make some judgment calls, type in an answer. And Schoberg and Jenkins make the point that PISA is a low stakes test. There's no individualized student data or feedback provided to those who write it, so the authors warn us that some students might not put all their efforts into answering the questions. And to account for this, PISA does ask 2 questions on the student survey portion, where students are first asked to rank their effort on the PISA test on a scale from 1 to 10, and second asked to rank their effort when they sit any examination on a scale of 1 to 10. Looking at the difference of those is meant to be a gauge of how seriously the students were taking the PISA. And unsurprisingly, students in high-scoring Asian countries were the ones that reported the maximum effort in both situations. And as you went down the ranking, students reported lower and lower levels of motivation because it's a low-stakes situation. So Schoberg and Jenkins caution us to also take that into consideration when looking at countries that may have poorer or lower performance. And that brings us to the last section, which is the politics of PISA. And this is the big red flag that's most commonly raised with regards to PISA. Going back to that assumption that education leads to a productive workforce, which results in a prosperous economy, and thus educational development becomes conflated with economic development. Now, this school of thought goes back to something called human capital theory, which is based on the assumption that in a modern economy, the human part of the workforce is more important for prosperity than any other economic infrastructure. This is also tied into the work of Eric Hanischek, who is responsible for the value-added model accountability systems in education, like the ones that are being primarily used in the United States, where student performance is used to rank schools, student performance is used to judge effectiveness of their teachers, student performance is used to determine funding for schools. Schoberg and Jenkins point out that Hanischek's work is widely used by the World Bank and the OECD in its analysis of the relationship between economic investment and educational quality. So, as I'm sure you're aware, that approach has been widely rejected by many different groups, comes under fire a lot down in the United States, and Schoberg and Jenkins are highlighting that that's the underlying theory between the OECD suggesting that investment in schools will lead to better economic output. And the authors would have us consider that this is a discussion to which science educators have an important contribution to make. Where does that leave us? As far as the main impact, that comes from equating a successful economy with an educated workforce that results in PISA being used as a driver to spur educational reforms. Schoberg and Jenkins had a great deal of concern about that, especially since curriculum's often set at a subnational level, but PISA is not a distinct metric of any specific curriculum. So the authors feel that any country's success on PISA should not be viewed directly as an endorsement of the quality of that country's school system. However, many countries are still interpreting their rankings and using those PISA results as a rationale for top-down educational reforms, starting with government and not necessarily including teachers. Schoberg and Jenkins say, the response of legislators to PISA results and the attendant publicity has been to propose ways in which school curricula can be modified in order to maximize PISA performance. Basically, teaching to the test. Schoberg and Jenkins have some issues with that because when viewed as strictly numerical data, national PISA scores and ranking do not give the full picture surrounding what they define as, quote, pedagogical practices and cultural, social, economic, and political contexts within which schooling takes place and which, among much else, influence student performance and attitudes. So what is the final word on PISA? Well, Schoberg and Jenkins acknowledge that PISA has brought a greater level of attention to math and science education, though they worry it's come at a cost of devaluing other subjects. And their main concern is that PISA rankings and scores are driving curricular reforms that may not be in the best interests of student learning. So, in their parting words to us, Schoberg and Jenkins urge the science education community to be critical in their analysis of the PISA assessment and also in how that data is used.
Adding to our STEM questions, we present 3 PISA-related discussion questions for you to consider. First, have you heard of PISA before this week? If yes, what experience do you have with it? Second, is the data provided by PISA valuable in any way to Canada, your province, your district, or you? And third, should curricular program development, i.e. STEM, and educational assessment reform, i.e. PISA, be driven by economics with a goal of preparing students to become the future workforce, sustaining a prosperous national economy? The following are sources we referred to while presenting this week's PISA article.